Good afternoon. Well, it's a wet day out there. So if you see me squinting, it's because my papers got wet on the way over and the ink is running. So, I want to talk a little bit about the history of our parish, but before I get into that, I just want to talk about the Carmelites for a moment, because our parish is dedicated to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and I think it's important for us to know something about the origin of the devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And actually, it dates back to about 1155. There were a number of pilgrims and crusader knights who were in the Middle East during one of the Crusades. And they got very despondent over the fighting and the war and the battles, and they just sought a place where they could be at peace and where life would be tranquil. And so a number of them sought out Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel in the scriptures is the place where Elijah went to find his own solitude when he was being pursued by the king's troops. And he hid out there in Mount Carmel and experienced his own solitude there. So these pilgrims and knights sought the same kind of solitude in the midst of all the carnage that they had experienced. And in about 1195, a man by the name of Berthold of Calabria kind of pulled these hermits together. And they were hermits. They lived in their own little places, and they had very little to do with each other. They took vows of silence and lived very austere lives. But Berthold pulled them together to celebrate Mass once a day and to have a meal together. And they began to live a community life, one that revolved around silence and prayer and work, but a community life. And as many knights did in those days, they dedicated their service to a lady. And it was usually the wife of a nobleman, or their own wife, or their own fiancé, their own betrothed. And these men decided that they would devote themselves to Our Lady and called her Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Now I mention that because really when we look at that history of the Carmelites, many times people go back to St. Simon Stock, who, when the Carmelites had finally moved from Mount Carmel, they moved to England, and in the 1240s sometime, St. Simon Stock was their prior, and he had a vision of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and she gave him the scapular. And most people don't look beyond that moment when they look at the Carmelites, but it really goes back further than that. And this devotion to Our Lady was something that came out of their lived experience in solitude, not this miraculous moment. I got nothing against miraculous moments, but I just think that a devotion to Our Lady based on that kind of determination to be of service in the name of the Blessed Mother is a very solid basis on which to build a community. So that's my little thing about Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And I want to just say a few words about our own history. This is not a real complex presentation, but so often I hear comments about, how did we get the name Our Lady of Mount Carmel? And why does this church look the way it looks? We look like a southwestern church. It looked like a church that you could pick up and put in Arizona or Texas or California and be right at home there, and that's true. So I want to answer some of those questions. So for the first thing, our parish, when it first began as a worshiping community, was not a parish. In the 1880s, there were a number of Catholics living in this area. Not a great number, but enough. And their parish was St. Joseph in Necker. And finally, the pastor of St. Joseph in Necker, Father Charles Dahmer, excuse me, said, if there's a household in your area where we could have Mass, I or one of my priests will come from Necker, St. Joseph's in Necker, and celebrate Mass for you. And so that's what they did. And they did that for a while. So a priest would come from St. Joseph in Necker, which is now known as St. Joseph's in Fullerton, to households in the area and celebrate Mass here. And they did that for quite a while. The only reason that we know that 1887, we picked that as the date of our beginning, is because it appears in the diary of Cardinal Gibbons. That's when the mission here was established. In 1892, a lady by the name of Elizabeth Hayes donated 5 acres to Cardinal Gibbons on this present site to establish a church. And in the next year, in 1893, a small wooden structure was built. And that structure was built right in front of where our front steps are, where the platform is for the entrance to the church. Right in front of that was the first church, and it was a small wooden structure. And things continued along that way for a while. At that time, when the permission was given to build a church here as a mission of St. Joseph's in Necker, Father Warren Currier was the pastor of St. Joseph's, and so became the first pastor of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Father Currier was an interesting priest. He was not only the pastor of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and by the way, these were Redemptorists. So Father Dahmer was a Redemptorist, Father Currier was a Redemptorist, and they're the order that established the parish at St. Joseph's in Necker and Our Lady of Mount Carmel. But Father Currier had some background in international negotiations, quite interestingly, and was a pretty intelligent and wise person. Anyway, Father Necker was the one who decided Father Currier was the one who decided that a church should be built here. And because he was the pastor of St. Joseph's, many names were considered at the time for this parish. It did not yet have a name. It was just the mission of St. Joseph. And many names were considered. St. James was one of the names that was considered, and several other names were considered for the parish. But Father Currier had a particular devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel. When he was a little boy, Father Currier was born in the West Indies, in the Caribbean. And when he was a little boy, he noticed that there was a Carmelite community of nuns who lived on the island. And he was intrigued by them. They lived in silence, but they did work, and they spent their time in prayer. And he was just intrigued by the lifestyle that they lived. Well, he went on to become a Redemptorist priest and came to Baltimore. And because of his interest in the Carmelites, he wrote a book about the Carmelites in the United States. And one of the things about the Carmelites in the United States is that they established their first house on the eastern shore of Maryland, in Port Tobacco. So he had some direct access to the Carmelite sisters there and was able to write his book based on their involvement in the community and their expansion throughout the United States. So he had this particular interest in them, and when it came to naming the parish, he asked that Cardinal Gibbons name the parish Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which he did, which Cardinal Gibbons did. Father Currier won out, really. Father Currier went on from being the pastor here to becoming an auxiliary bishop. And he was an auxiliary bishop in Baltimore and Washington, and subsequently spent most of his time in Washington after this, and died rather suddenly at a pretty early age. He was in his mid-50s when he died, but he was a very successful priest. But he was our founding pastor. One of the things about the early church, the wooden church structure was a pretty simple affair, but it had in its front, right under the eaves of the roof, a platform with a marble statue of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And that was replicated when this church was built in 1938. And the statue that was placed here in 1938 is still here. You know, things went along pretty smoothly during that time. Starting in 1904, there was a succession of like 3 pastors that came and went relatively quickly, and they were all Redemptorists. But finally, it was determined by the priests that St. Joseph in Fullerton, by that time it became in St. Joseph's in Fullerton, that it was time to establish a parish here. And so the mission of Our Lady of Mount Carmel finally became an independent parish. In 1919, Father Nicholas Giselli was appointed the pastor here. Now, any of you who are longtime Mount Carmel parishioners know that name. Father Giselli was a legend here. Father Giselli was here for about 36 years as the pastor. Significant time. And everything, just about everything built here, save the high school, was built by him. In 1919, he asked Cardinal Gibbons if he could just be a country priest. Father Giselli himself was born in Italy and was ordained in Rome in 1901, but emigrated to the United States and took up residence in Baltimore. And then, while serving in the Sykesville and Washington, D.C. area for a while, he knew it was time for him to be a pastor. He just said, I just want to be a country priest. Which was noble of him and really considering his background, a pretty significant statement. To put it bluntly, Father Giuselli came from money. His family was fairly wealthy, but he wanted to live a humble life as a humble country priest. Well, Cardinal Gibbons said, well, I have just a place for you. It's a place in Middle River. He said, but you're going to have to build. And build he did. In 1920, he started what is currently the lower church here, and the cornerstone was laid in 1920. So he began that structure then, and the lower church was finished in 1921. So pretty quick construction. He built a rectory. He built a convent. He built a school. Eventually, he built a Knights Columbus Hall. Everything here but the high school was really constructed during his time here. And it was pretty significant endeavor on his part. The upper church was not completed until 1938. And you can see the cornerstone out here at the front of the building. That indicates that it was laid in 1938. So the upper church was finally finished in 1938, and quite honestly, Father Giuselli and his family contributed quite a bit of money to the construction of this church. Because it was his dream. This structure was his dream. And it was in his mind as he was building the lower church. He knew exactly what he wanted to build. Father Giuselli, a number of times, went on vacation with his family to Texas. And he found himself constantly being drawn to one of the churches in Texas, in El Paso. And the church was an old mission church. It was first built in the 1680s. But then there was a fire there, and it was rebuilt in 1907 or 1908. And that's when he saw it, when it was being rebuilt, and finally when it was finished its construction. When he would go on vacation, he was continually drawn to this church. He loved the architecture of the church. And so finally, when it came time to build the upper church here, the dream that he had was the dream to build a church like the one in El Paso. The name of that church in El Paso was Nuestra Señora del Carmen, Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And so Father Giuselli asked for the drawings of the church. He had drawings made up of the church. And he shared them with John Eyring, an architect. John Eyring and his sons, who were builders, brought that dream to fruition with this building. I think one of the impressive things about this process for me was that Our Lady of Mount Carmel was woven through our history from its very conception under Father Currier through the building of this church, a replica of Our Lady of Mount Carmel in El Paso, to that point. And I hope that our devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel continues to this very day.
Thank you, Monsignor, so much for that very intriguing history of our parish. Starting next week, we're going to discontinue live stream, but we are going to continue to pre-record our faith talks. So we hope that you'll continue to join us on Facebook. Thank you.